so we use the terms willpower, self-control, self-discipline. They all mean the same thing. I'm going to use the term self-control because that's the one I'm more comfortable with. It's what we talk about in our papers, and it's probably the more familiar term to most people. But it is our ability to control our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And all day, everyone's been talking about preventative causes in health, preventative diseases, things that people can do differently in their lives that will make a huge difference in health. And I think that self-control is just fundamental to that nothing happens without it. There were, a while ago, in psychology, we're always trying to find how to make people, we are at least currently trying to find how to make people's lives better. And for a while, we thought it was self-esteem. We thought if we could just make everyone feel really good about themselves, they would do all these great things and everything would be great. And self-esteem did not pan out for us at all. And Dan, if you want to talk about that later, I can definitely fill you in on that story. But it turns out self-control does seem to be that kind of magic skill we were looking for, the thing that we can foster in people that will really, really change their lives. Oh, this is my old slides. Oh, sad.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna go without these for a little bit, so I made these slides before I came to your conference, and then I saw all these talks, and I was like, I need to restructure this. So I'll go on my own. How many of you have heard of the marshmallow experiment? Okay, some of you. So this is a really cool classic study in self-control. They brought in 4-year-olds and they gave them a marshmallow. And they said, if you can wait till I come back to eat that marshmallow, I will give you a second marshmallow. And then they measured whether the children were able to wait or not. And if you ever look up video footage of this, you can tell that they're exercising self-control. 4-year-olds do not hide that. And they're rubbing it on their face, and they're looking at it really sadly. And it's a great thing. So what they found, what was really, really cool and really far-sighted of these researchers, is that they followed these kids through to high school and looked at their college admissions exams. So in the US, that's the SATs. And they found that children who were better able to wait for that second marshmallow did better on their college admissions exams. And so much better. So on a 1,200-point scale, they did about 250 points better on their SATs if they were able to wait for that second marshmallow. So this was really exciting, and this brought in then a whole cavalcade of really great research showing the benefits of self-control. Self-control is a better predictor of college grades than IQ, which is very inspiring because IQ doesn't seem to be that controllable, but self-control probably is. Supervisors with better self-control are better rated by their subordinates than supervisors with poor self-control. People with better self-control report less depression, less anxiety. They report better relationships with the people they're close to. It seems to be a really broad skill that makes a huge difference in people's lives. So one thing that I think is good to know about self-control is how it works. And I find it fundamentally interesting because it's what I study, but I think you will too. So I'm going to skip my old slides that I don't like anymore. And I'm going to go to this one. So what we've found is that self-control is actually a lot like physical strength. So when you exercise a muscle, that muscle becomes fatigued, and there comes a point where you can't use it anymore. And so we found with self-control that after one act of self-control, it becomes harder for people to exercise self-control. So one of the creative ways that the researchers have studied this is with this cookies versus radishes study. So they gave participants a plate that contained cookies and radishes. And they told some participants that they should eat the cookies and avoid eating the radishes. This does not take self-control from most people. In the other group, participants were told to eat the radishes and don't eat the cookies. And they made sure the cookies were warm and gooey, and we're very sadistic in our lab. And so we gave people unsolvable puzzles. So we use unsolvable puzzles to measure persistence in the face of failure. And that's been a theme these past couple days. I've heard a bunch of times people talking about moving past failure and continuing to try, because eventually you're never going to succeed if you don't keep trying. well, these are really unsolvable, so they're really never going to succeed. But they don't know that. So what we found was that participants who had to eat the radishes and resist the cookies then spent less time on the puzzles. So they were less able to push through, to just keep working. They were more likely to come out after 7 minutes and say, I'm done, I give up, tell me what the answer is, I want to go home. And that's one of many studies that have shown this basic result. So they've used all different kinds of self-control, all different kinds of measures, and this seems to be the pattern that always emerges. What we've also found is that decision-making taps into the same resource. So how many of you, after a particularly long or stressful or very taxing, self-control taxing day, go home and open the refrigerator and just stare? And you have, and you have no idea what you're going to eat or how you're going to make that happen. And research shows that decision-making relies on the same resource that self-control relies on. And this works two ways. So if you have people make a bunch of decisions in the lab, they then show poorer self-control. On the flip side, if you have people exert self-control or make a bunch of decisions and then make more decisions, they make poorer decisions. So first of all, if you let them, they will defer the decision. They will choose not to make a decision. But if you make them make a decision, they will go with a default option. They will choose the extremes, but they're choosing suboptimally in a variety of ways. And so I've been thinking about being here at this conference. I've been thinking about the different questions that I'm talking to all of you and learning what the different debates are in the spa industry and things like that. I think this is relevant to some of the discussion about what kind of options should be available to customers, what kind of menus should be available, and things like that. And the idea is decision-making does take resources, and so there is something about decision-making that may take away from the restorative process. And that may not be, and maybe only if it's overwhelming, but it's something to think about. So, self-control being a limited resource may seem like an excuse to fail at self-control, but there are really great ways to manage it. And that's why knowing that it's limited can be really beneficial. And those ways are to conserve it, to replenish it, and to strengthen it. And I'll go over the research on these various ways. So, first of all, conserving it. So, one thing that they found about people with high self-control is that they experience temptation less often. And part of the reason is that they structure their environment to not be overly tempting. They don't trust their self-control to get them through everything. They don't keep the house stocked with junk food. They don't put their video games on the computer they do work on. They keep their lives structured so that they're not tempted unnecessarily. And I think this is a really cool idea, the idea of setting up our environment so that we succeed. Another thing people can do to conserve resources is to make lifestyle changes sequentially. So people set New Year's resolutions, they come up with 5 or 20 things that they want to be different about their lives, and they try to do all of them at once. And because self-control is a limited resource, it's going to be really hard for you to eat your vegetables and be nice to that coworker you don't like and go to the gym at the end of the day. It's just not going to happen. And so you can make those changes one at a time. And what's really cool is the research has shown that habits don't require self-control. So they did a diary study where they measured what people did in the day, how much self-control they exerted, and they found that people who were in the habit of going to the gym didn't stop going to the gym when their self-control was taxed. People that weren't in the habit of going to the gym threw that out the window first thing. But the idea is that habits happen relatively automatically. You don't have to force yourself as much when something's habitual, and that's what makes it not tax self-control resources. And I think habits are a really exciting direction for making people's lives better. And what's really cool about the habit research, sorry, I have a tangent moment, is that if people want to change a behavior, the habit research shows that the best thing to do is for them to go to a new environment. And that's what you guys are. You guys are a new environment that people can establish better habits and make bigger changes in their lives because the things that cue their bad behavior aren't there. A second way is to replenish it. So the research has actually shown that self-control relies on glucose. So when people exercise self-control, afterwards their glucose drops. When glucose is low, people are more likely to fail at self-control. And to really test this, we did the same basic paradigm where we have 2 acts of self-control and see how the first affects the second. But then we gave people lemonade in between. And that lemonade was either sweetened with sugar or with Splenda. And the sugar will, at least temporarily, spike their glucose. And we found that participants who were given the lemonade that was sweetened with sugar didn't show the effect of the first act of self-control on the second one. They didn't show depletion. And so we say sugar works in the lab, not in the diet. We used sugar because we wanted something that metabolized very quickly, that we could measure quickly, so we could send our participants home, because they don't want to wait there forever. But the fundamental thing that comes out of this is that the brain needs fuel, and it uses a lot of fuel for self-control. So what does this say about dieting? My advisor and I don't know if dieting is the best use of self-control. And by dieting, I mean temporary, often unsustainable changes in what people eat in the service of losing weight. And the failure rates for dieting are enormous, especially if you look long-term, if you look 5 years down the road. And we think part of the reason is that when people diet, they're denying their body the very fuel they need to control their behaviors. And so it becomes very hard to do this really difficult thing, which is control yourself, when you're not giving your body the fuel it needs, your brain the fuel it needs to exercise that self-control. Another thing, so the really promising direction of this research is that you can strengthen self-control. So earlier I talked about it being like a muscle, where it gets fatigued after use. You can also build up the strength over time. So there's these really cool studies that they did in Australia where they assigned people to a self-control practice condition. So this is across a bunch of different studies. So in one study, participants were assigned to an exercise program. In another study, participants were assigned to a money management program. Another study assigned participants to use their non-dominant hand for brushing their teeth and opening doorknobs, and a couple other tasks. And all of these things require self-control, and they found that after a certain amount of time, so there were different lengths for the different studies, but at minimum they were 2 weeks, they found that participants' self-control improved. So they were less depletable. So a first act of self-control had less effect on a second act of self-control. They reported losing their temper less often. The people who weren't in the money management program still said they spent less impulsively. The people who weren't in the exercise program were still exercising more. They were still building the self-control strength, and it was applying across their life. They were smoking fewer cigarettes. There's a list of effects that came from this self-control practice. And something I was thinking about the other day, that one of the speakers was talking about cultivating mindfulness in your guests, so trying to get them to focus on the moment when they're there. And I think that that fits really well with your goals, and that's self-control practice. The idea that, trying to focus ourselves in the moment takes self-control, and that's a really great kind of self-control practice because it has all the other benefits that mindfulness already has. So I appreciate you guys listening to me talk on self-control. If you have any questions, you should absolutely ask me. But I'm really glad I got to share this today.
Thank you very much, Jessica.